Controversy in North Korea, an opportunity in South Korea. Our speaker today, our guest today, Doug Bandow from Cato Institute, is an expert on these issues, and we're lucky to have him today. He's been on many networks and been in national media many times, and he's going to talk to us a little bit today about his expertise, his studies, and what he has to offer in terms of not only foreign policy and civil liberties, which are your expertises, but also what's going on in our nation. So thank you for coming today. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Happy to be on, very much.
Sure. So you just wrote something on South Korea, and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we have a free trade agreement that was negotiated by the Bush administration. I think it would be a very positive step. It would help open up the South Korean market to American products. The market is rather closed to America today. This would help bring in greater opportunities for American exporters, including people in Hawaii who are trying to sell products overseas. It would also be very helpful geopolitically. We see China is taking an increasing role within East Asia, a rising military and political power, but also very important economic power. So it makes sense for the U.S. to try to expand American economic penetration as well. So what we want to do is maximize the opportunity of Americans to trade with South Koreans. Unfortunately, President Obama and the Democratic Congress were not very high on this agreement. They spent roughly 2 years saying they didn't like it. Now the president has turned around on that, and earlier this year announced that he wanted to move the agreement forward. But he basically has to force the South Koreans to renegotiate. They're not inclined to do so. They figure they struck a deal. Why should they take the political heat again from changing it? So I wrote a paper for the Cato Institute, a research organization that I work for, arguing that this is a really important treaty for Americans. What we need is congressional ratification, and the president needs to push it. Even if the South Koreans don't want to make changes, this is really a good agreement for America, and we can build from there. The concerns are issues like automobiles and agriculture. Well, if you don't get this first step, we're not going to make progress on any of the other steps. It's really critical, I think, both economically and geopolitically, to move forward on this.
So most recently we had in the news our Congressman Charles Deju, who was pushing for the South Korean, he's Korean, and he was pushing for the South Korean free trade policy, and it seemed like President Obama had finally turned around, but you don't think it's going to work, huh?
Well, the challenge is, the president does say now that he wants the agreement to work. Mm-hmm. The challenge is he's gone to the South Koreans, so they have agreement they signed. South Korean, previous president took political heat. There's opposition in the streets. It's the same thing you see in America. They took all this heat for negotiating this. He's now going to the South Koreans and say, make more concessions. Well, the problem is they face the same kind of political pressures that you have in the United States. So unless he's willing to temper that, unless he's willing to accept the fact this has to be a real compromise, and you can't just go to somebody who's negotiated the agreement and expect them to throw it out, we're not going to get anywhere. So I think he has to rethink this. I think he's genuinely committed to increasing exports. I think he has made a commitment to try to move this agreement forward. That's very positive. But unless he's willing to, kind of step back and recognize we can't browbeat the South Koreans on this, that day is over. He's got to be willing to make that compromise to move this forward.
So what do you see happening? Do you have any? If you looked into your crystal ball, what do you think was going to happen with that?
Well, I'm afraid we're in for potentially protracted negotiations. Mm-hmm. The South Koreans don't want to give very much. The president has gone out on a limb. He said he wants this agreement, but he wants changes. His most fervent supporters, labor unions and others, are saying yes. Don't make any concessions. Mm-hmm. It's going to be hard, I think, for him to back away from that. The one bit of good news is the Republican-dominated House of Representatives next term is likely to be more open to this agreement than the previous one. Some Republicans are skeptical on trade issues, but not nearly as skeptical as a lot of the Democrats who have been defeated and are not going to be in office anymore. So if the president is able to get an agreement that he can accept, we are more likely to see congressional approval. But it's going to be a major step for the president.
Well, wasn't the president just in Korea?
Yes.
And that would have been a good time for him to do that.
Well, that is what's so embarrassing, is earlier this year, the president said, I want to have this wrapped up by the meeting, the G20 meeting, major economic summit in Seoul.
Yes.
Because it's a perfect opportunity. You meet with the president of Korea, you could announce this, but they couldn't make the deal. So, embarrassingly, he had to come home. So that a lot of egg on his face, I think, because of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now North Korea is always a concern here in Hawaii, especially with nuclear capabilities, and we worry about you know, are we in range or aren't we in range, and what could happen to Hawaii? So what are your thoughts on the current regime and what's happening in North Korea?
Well, North Korea is one of the strangest places on earth. I visited there 20 years ago. I mean, it's a very odd place. I think that Hawaiians don't have to worry in one sense, which is the North Koreans, you know, the regime, I think, is evil. It's not stupid. I mean, these are not people who want to disappear in a puff of smoke. And they know that any attack on the United States would be met with overwhelming retaliation. I mean, what I tell people is, you know, Kim Jong-il, the current leader, he wants these virgins in this life, not the next life. I mean, he's not looking towards, you know, let me go out in a kind of a grand gesture. He wants to live. And in fact, he's trying to install his youngest son as his successor. He's thinking years down the line. So I think that, you know, the good thing about Hawaii is you're protected by America's military. The North Koreans know that. But there's still a problem there because this is a very odd actor. It's an awful regime. It's impoverished and starved its own people. Has a large military that threatens South Korea, and it's going through a leadership transition now. It is in many ways like the old Ottoman Empire. You know, what you have in the north are kind of multiple families. You have the dear leader, as he is called, 69. He has at least 3 sons. You know, he has some illegitimate kids, we figure. You know, the sons are from different mothers. You know, then he has a new wife who's not one of the others, and there's a half-brother kind of off in Europe, and, you know, his brother-in-law is very powerful, and his sister is, you know. So what you have is this kind of family-oriented system and a lot of different players. And then you have a lot of military and political people. They've been waiting a long time because this regime, created in 1948, has only had 2 people running it. It's the father, called the great leader, and the son, the dear leader. So there's a lot of people who've been waiting around for a long time, you know, to get rid of, you know, these people and to take over themselves. So it could be a messy business. His father took about 20 years to install him in positions of power and move him upwards. So he was at the center of the party. He was making appointments. He was putting in people loyal to him. Well, he's only had about 2 years to start trying to move his son up. He had a stroke 2 years ago. And that seems to have gotten him really thinking about succession. Well, 2 years isn't nearly enough. I mean, his son, 28, 29, looks very young. He's been made a 4-star general. Well, nobody really takes this seriously. So if the dear leader doesn't live for a long time, I don't think the son will ever take power. But what everybody's nervous about is a power struggle. You know, what happens if the dear leader dies in 2 or 3 years? You know, does the brother-in-law think it's his turn? Is there some general who's going to try to bring his troops in? Is it a coalition? We don't know. So that puts everybody in the region nervous. Chinese are nervous, Japanese, South Koreans, and we're kind of nervous about how this is all going to play out.
We do have, you know, the missile defense system on Kauai, which does a lot of practicing, which makes us feel a little bit comforted. But 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago on 4th of July, or last 4th of July, not this past one, but the one before that, you know, we were planning a big fireworks show. Well, all over the island, different people have shows going on, and he was threatening us with, so we were really hoping he didn't ruin our 4th of July, our American celebration. Okay, so what else do you write about? I mean, your specialty is in civil liberties and in foreign policy, but what else are you covering right now? What's hot at the Cato Institute?
Well, there are a lot of issues. I mean, healthcare remains an important issue. I speak a lot on that. Because, you know, even though legislation was passed in March, we have a new Congress, which is more skeptical, and the Supreme Court is going to be hearing a challenge on it. And I think it's a very important challenge. I mean, Americans tend not to focus on the letter of the Constitution. But when the founders created the Constitution, they created a government, a national government, that they said was going to be limited with only enumerated powers. You know, states have what we call general police power. I mean, states can go out there and kind of do what they want. You know, they're constrained by their Constitution, but, you know, outside of that, they're expected to kind of regulate a lot of things. The national government was going to be limited. You know, so you go to Article 1, Section 8, and here's the list of what the national government can do. That's, you know, Congress shall be able to do this. They're listing it. They're not saying you do anything. They're saying these are the things. Well, if you go down that list, you don't find anywhere where the federal government can mandate health care. There's nothing that comes close to that. There's nothing in our history where the federal government has ever tried something like that. So I think this is really the final argument over whether or not there's any limitation on what the national government can do. So it's a very serious case. So I've been talking a lot about that. Cato's working on that. Cato has helped file amicus briefs in court saying this is very serious. We have court cases going in Florida, Virginia, and Michigan by filed in Virginia and Florida by state governments, in Michigan by a private group.
Is it a class action or?
No, I mean, these are simply challenges to the federal. I mean, class action, typically, you go out there and you get 1 million people. You know, everybody's, I don't know, bought some product and they kind of put them together. So this is one where they, I mean, you know, states, there are enough states, you don't have a class action because there are a limited number of states. So one of the cases, the Florida case has something like 20 states joining together. For the Virginia case is the Virginia state government. Michigan, it's a private group. But they, you know, if they would win, of course, it would affect all of us. So that's an important issue. And we're all looking at spending. I mean, if you look at the finances for the U.S. government, effectively the U.S. is bankrupt. We have a national debt of $13.5 trillion. You know, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, figures the deficits over the next decade could easily run another $13 trillion. There are all these bailouts that are continuing. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac continue to waste money on housing. The Federal Housing Administration is doing more insurance in the area, insuring more mortgages. People are calling it the new subprime lending crisis. I mean, that's all we need is another one. We're closing banks at rapid rate. You know, pension funds get closed. The federal government takes those over. And then there's Medicare and Social Security, these long-term massive programs. So our hope is people have to really wake up and demand a change in spending. And we see, I think, some of that in the outgrowth of the recent election with the Tea Party movement and some of the Republican Party gains. You know, the Republican Party, I mean, I wouldn't go overboard in terms of how committed are they to fiscal responsibility, but clearly, you know, we saw a change in Congress created by people who are frustrated because the current administration and the current Congress didn't seem very sensitive to the notion of fiscal crisis. We're just kind of throwing money at everything. That's another important issue. There are a lot of international issues, too. I mean, we still have 2 wars going on. Afghanistan, I visited Afghanistan back in May with a colleague. You know, the problem there is not our troops. I mean, they're brave, they fight well. The problem is if you want a counterinsurgency policy, you want nation building, you have to have a partner in Afghanistan to work with. The Afghan government is corrupt, it's incompetent, it's inefficient, and it's very hard to find anybody in Afghanistan who speaks highly of it. I mean, there are very few people who think that, you know, Hamid Karzai and the people around him are really the answer, you know, for Afghanistan's problems. So I'm very pessimistic over the long term in terms of dealing in Afghanistan. You know, China, military spending, you know, what is America's role in the world, especially at a time with these financial crises. You know, there's a pretty broad agenda there for me and for other people at Cato to be involved in.